Welcome to a 1-hour Pallium Project archival podcast of a professional development event. The views presented in this session are those of our expert guests and participants from across Canada. In this podcast, Jackie Peden, an advanced practice nurse in hospice palliative care, interviews Wendy Edey, Director of Counselling for the Hope Foundation of Alberta. This session is entitled Magnifying Hope, Shrinking Hopelessness.
We are really pleased that you're here to speak with us, Wendy. Can you tell us a little bit about the Hope Foundation?
The Hope Foundation of Alberta is a Centre for Hope Studies associated with the University of Alberta Faculty of Education, Department of Educational Psychology. We are a centre for the study of hope in practice. So how to use hope, how to work with hope, how to talk with people about hope. We have an on-site library. We have a website with an international database on hope research literature. We do workshops and support groups and keynote speakers, and at the University of Alberta there's even a credit course to be taken at the graduate and undergraduate level in hope. But perhaps more important than that, we talk to a lot of people and with a lot of people about hope in our counseling program and in-group kinds of sessions that we offer. So when we say hope in practice, we really do mean the practice of talking about hope or putting activities in place that are thought through the research to enhance hope, to draw attention to hope.
Can you tell us what hope is?
Well, what hope is varies according to the purpose for which you wanted to study hope. We tend to think of hope in terms of a disease and treatment paradigm, where we think of hope as something objective, an assessment. What's the likelihood of cure, for example? That's a kind of traditional way of thinking about hope. How much hope do I have? Do I have 85% or 75%? But we can think of hope much more broadly than that. If we think of a conversational paradigm for thinking about hope, then hope is really a shorthand that we use in conversation to refer to a whole bunch of constructs. It's a noun, so we talk about having hope or being hopeful as an adjective, or we can also use hope as a verb in terms of I hope that I will feel better. I hope that I will have an opportunity to have some of my needs met. So hope is actually a broad term. It has a kind of planning and goals aspect to it. It also has a sort of sustaining that resourcefulness from inside us characteristic too. So if we're talking about hope in terms of sports, often we're looking at kind of goals, my hope of success. But if we're talking about hope in terms of palliative care, often we're thinking about that resource inside people that allows them to still think a bit about what the future might hold, but be healthy, be okay, be feeling all right.
What influences hope?
Well, there are a lot of studies about what influences hope. The primary thing that comes out, study after study, if we study hope in the doctor-patient relationship, hope in nursing studies, hope even in studies of teaching and students, the thing that patients or clients identify most often as being part of what made them hopeful was a sense of connectedness. So that in Gina Wong-Wiley's study of hope in the doctor-patient relationship for people who have HIV, for example, those patients said that it wasn't so much the really smart physicians that gave them hope, but the ones who were willing to be connected to them in a genuine, personal way, to answer their questions, to accept articles from magazines that they might bring in, to be collaborative and to keep them involved in whatever might be happening with their treatment. And it seems that hope has a huge relational element. Another thing that influences hope appears to be the amount of control that people have. And I don't mean control over making ultimate decisions and big things. It seems to be the little things that matter in terms of having control. just being able to decide certain things for myself, to have some say over the way that I might be treated. Hope is also influenced by the idea of having possibilities or having options. We tend to think in terms of having only one or two options. Will she live or will she die? Will she succeed or will she fail? But really, in most cases, we have many, many different options. How will I live? In what way would I be treated? Where will I be, for example? So that seeing a world in which there are many possibilities other than just two narrow choices seems to be an important element to influencing hope. The option that there might be humor, the option that there might be more than one way to see a situation. Another thing that influences hope is sensory cues. When we ask in research to people, what is it that reminds you of hope? They point to pictures on the wall. They talk to us about the fragrances of being in a particular set of woods at a certain time. They talk about eating chocolate. So sensory cues are an important influence on hope. And much research shows that we can actually produce a sensory cue that people have associated with hope. For example, if you've had a conversation about hope in terms of being in the woods, the old pine woods where I used to live, I think about the smell of the woods and the sound of the birds singing in the woods, that if you have that conversation again at a later point, it seems to be a very easy shortcut back to hope. Pictures on the wall, things that people can carry with them. Right now there's a lot of research being done in the area of treasured objects and what it means to people to have a treasured object that they keep with them, that they can pull out and look at in times when they need hope. So probably the last thing that is important in terms of influencing hope is leadership from others. Just this morning, I was talking in my counseling practice to a young man who was telling me that he needs an apartment, a place to live that's very clean because of a lung condition that he has. And when he was looking at a place with his parents, they were saying to him, well, you have to know exactly how much of the utilities are going to cost, and you have to know exactly how much the damage deposit is going to cost, and you have to have all the details in place for a contract. And that this particular leadership is wise leadership in looking for a place to live, but it wasn't very wise leadership in the area of hope for him, partly because he is moving into a situation where he can't afford to live by himself anymore, and he has a very low income, and so he has to live with others. And the leadership in hope that he would really need would be for them to say, this is a very clean place, isn't it? And these people do seem to be very friendly here. And it does appear to be a place that will work out. All of those things are true. And so we can, in very subtle ways, offer leadership to others in hope rather than in hopelessness or in caution or in despair. And it is the leadership strategies that we can take with others towards hope that are perhaps the thing that over which we have the most influence.
When you talked about the pictures, it reminded me of when I was visiting the Edmonton General Hospital. There was a group of pictures on a wall that was relating to hope. And so there was pictures that people had of probably their grandchildren. There was pets. And I thought, yes, I could find hope in a picture of my new puppy. I think that, because it's the future, really. And with grandchildren, it feels more like the future when you look at that type of a picture.
And the pictures that people will choose will be quite different for different people. The Caritas Health Group has made a very dedicated effort to have hope displays and very special hope projects in their healthcare centers so that people have an opportunity to express what would be their own hope, both patients and staff. And just last week, when my mother was admitted to Grey Nuns Hospital here in Edmonton, and my father brought her in from out of town, one of the things he wanted to tell me when we first spoke afterwards was, I saw your hope tree, and I looked for you on that hope tree. He didn't even know a hope tree would be there, but as soon as he saw it, he was attracted to going towards it and to looking for things that would be familiar and meaningful to him.
Which probably gave him comfort, being in that hospital in that setting, your mom being ill. Can you tell me how you would deal with unrealistic hope?
The question of unrealistic hope is a question that is probably of most concern in the area of medicine. And there has been a lot written in the area of false hope and unrealistic hope. One person has written that false despair is more dangerous than false hope. And that false hope is really just hope that one person has that another person doesn't share. So, for example, if you're just hoping that you'll feel better tomorrow, and I'm thinking she won't feel better tomorrow, I'd say your hope is false hope. But really, it's still your hope. I'm just calling it false because it's not my hope. One of the problems that we have with the idea of unrealistic hope is who gets to decide what's realistic and what isn't. When we think of the amazing things that have happened in the history of the universe, each and every one of those things happened once for the first time. And before that, it was absolutely impossible. In 1954, for example, Roger Bannister ran a mile in less than 4 minutes. And before that, it was proven to be physiologically impossible for a human being to do that. So I don't know if Roger Bannister just didn't listen to all the statistics or didn't read up on it or why he thought it would be a good idea to try to run a mile in 4 minutes. Interestingly enough, as soon as he had done so, a second person did that also within 3 weeks. So if we always judge the realism of hope based on what has happened before, we aren't really taking into account, even if it's 100% unrealistic, we're not taking into account the notion that everything that ever happened that was new happened once first. So even as I'm saying that, I can feel the blood pressure raising all across the 4 western provinces and New Brunswick because I can understand that people think, well, people get so unrealistic. We tell them, it's time to go into palliative care, and they're going, no, I'm waiting for treatment still. And I think that if we think about the history of the people that we've known, sometimes a thing can be impossible, and I mean impossible now, but possible later. So it may be impossible for a person to accept palliative care today, but even by tomorrow, enough things might have changed so that it would be possible. I knew a man named Daryl Skidnick who was the editor of a newspaper in Fort McMurray, and he wrote about his illness in the Fort McMurray newspaper, so we have a record of some things that he wrote. And after a discussion about hope, he went home and he wrote in the newspaper, he wrote, "My cancer has spread, and the doctors aren't hopeful that I will be able to make a full recovery." Notice he wrote, "The doctors aren't hopeful." He didn't write, "There is no hope." Later on, he wrote about some of the treatments that were being put in place now. But he wrote, "At least for now, my hopes for a medical cure are being replaced with my hopes for a cure through prayer or positive thinking or healthy living." So we can see in the development of this writing how he had begun to think about hope. Not, is there hope or is there not hope, but, well, if I can't hope for one thing, what actually can I hope for? And who isn't hopeful? It's the doctor that's not hopeful, but I can still be hopeful. We might have deemed any of these hopes to be realistic or unrealistic, but to Daryl, these were hopes, and he was thinking about how can I face this situation in which people are predicting my certain death and still be hopeful at the same time. And he had thought that through very carefully before he wrote to the citizens of Fort McMurray. Cheryl Nikolajchuk, who has been a great hope researcher in the area of palliative care, writes about some myths that we seem to hold on to in terms of hope. One being the myth of truth-telling. And that's the idea that everyone needs and wants to hear the truth, the real facts, the truth right now. But really, some people, in order to have hope, they don't really want to hear the truth because they don't know if they can hear what we think is the truth and have hope at the same time. And it may be impossible for them to do that now, but still possible later. It may not have to be done all in one day. It may not even be important. Another of the myths that she writes about is the myth of the magic bullet, where we tend to think that there's a cure for everything. There's a solution for everything, we just have to find it. And that if there is no magic bullet, there is no hope. And people have to think their way through this too. They have to ask themselves, how can I be hopeful if we can't find the magic bullet? And they have to ask themselves, at what point do I stop looking for the magic bullet? And sometimes we don't all stop at the same time. Sometimes the person stops looking, but the relatives are still looking. Sometimes the medical people are still looking when the person has stopped looking. Sometimes the patient is looking for the magic bullet long after the other people have stopped. Eventually, though, we have to think that there will be some coming together of this search. And finally, the other myth that she writes about is the myth of immortality. And this is the idea that in some way any of us would be able to live forever. When we think about that, then we think that to have a death predicted is to have no hope at all. And this, of course, is ridiculous because we know even from the time of our birth that there will be a death. And that doesn't remove all hope from the world. There's still hope in the world every day, even though we know each and every one of us is going to die. So why should we assume that when death is imminent, that hope suddenly vanishes? There's still hope out there, hope around. If we were to go out on any given day, we could find 100 evidences that there's hope in the world. It doesn't vanish on the day that we begin to speak of death. It's still there.
I think one of the most challenges that I had when I was working in palliative care was talking to my clients and their families about end-of-life issues with that worry that I was going to threaten their hope. But when you talked about knowing the truth now, it sort of reminded me of this challenge. How do you know when to talk to somebody about end-of-life issues, and how do you do that? I mean, it's part of our role as a nurse in the community.
I think it's important to issue invitations to people to talk about issues and to respect then what they do with that invitation. Just as we would issue an invitation to a gathering, and we would let people decide whether they want to attend. Just this week, I said to someone, pretty soon people are going to begin to ask us about do not resuscitate orders. They're going to ask us what we want to do. If a crisis comes up, do we want to bring this person back? And the person to whom I was speaking said, oh yeah, I guess so, and went on to another topic. So that's a pretty good clue to me that this isn't something that we're ready to discuss yet. However, having raised the topic, I know that it will come back later and be ready for discussion. I did a whole bunch of conversational work with kidney patients who were on dialysis. They said that really there were times at which they wanted information, that in which it was hopeful for them to have information. And then there were other times after they got the information when they just had to put it aside and think, I'm going to do this today and that tomorrow, and the next time something's wrong, I think somebody will, they'll probably tell me about that. They had the big picture at first, but then it was better for them just to wander off and ignore the picture, and for us to understand that to give people a binder full of information and then blame them for not having read it later, or to think, well, I gave it to them and therefore they read it and so they know it, is perhaps not realistic on our part. What is more realistic is from time to time to offer invitations to speak to things that might be relevant, maybe family visits or things that need to be taken care of, details, paperwork, the idea of what things might still be left to be done that could be done, these treatments that could be chosen. People will find a readiness to talk about these things if we are willing. I think that in my own past, a lot of times it's been me that's been chicken to raise topics. Now I'm not very chicken about raising topics, and I don't worry if people don't pick it up. I think, well, I raised it, and often they'll come back and raise it again, or I can raise it again later.
So it sounds like we shouldn't have our own agenda of what it is that we want to talk about. We need to allow the patient or the individual to guide us in what information they actually need at that time.
Well, I think if we do have our own agenda, we'll soon feel that sense of rising frustration that comes up inside us when you're trying to talk to someone about something and it's not going well. I often feel that feeling inside of me. I feel it as a stress. I'm conducting a conversation and suddenly I'm feeling stress inside me, and if I start to pay attention to that stress, often it's really telling me that I seem to be working way too hard at that conversation, that the other person is really not participating in it, that they're looking for a way out, and that's why it's seeming like so much work for me, is that they're just not there with me yet. And I say the word yet because yet is a hope word. That person is not ready for this conversation yet. And when she is, then we'll be able to have it. The language of yet and the language of when, these are important languages when we think about hope. They give us reassurance that, when you're able to eat solid food again. Talking about the language of yet and the language of when is different, than making promises. Promise someone you'll be able to eat solid food tomorrow. Well, maybe they will and maybe they won't, and then you've broken your promise. But we can always talk to people about when you're able to eat solid food, when you're not in so much pain, when some of these details are taken care of. Some of these important languages are very subtle.
So what does threaten hope?
What threatens hope? Loss of control threatens hope terribly. Isolation, feeling like you're the only person that understands you. Just feeling like nothing that you say could matter, that your own condition is just totally misunderstood by everyone else. Very threatening thing to hope. Another thing that threatens hope a lot is a phenomenon that we call bruising, which is when a lot of bad things happen in succession and we don't really get over one thing before the next thing happens. Say your sister died last year and your brother died last month, and now you've been diagnosed with a serious illness as well. You don't just feel the impact of your diagnosis. It's as if you had a big bruise and you bumped it again, and you feel multiple pain, much larger than even the impact of your own diagnosis. And in the case of the bruising effect, we have to think that people are feeling a level of pain that is coming from many things. And bruises, in general, bruises are healed by time and rest, and we can't do a lot actively. But what we can do is protect a person from being bruised more. We can be gentle around them. So bruising is an important thing. And the other thing is to just have things keep on turning out badly. You're right back in the same place that you were in before, and nothing ever seems to change. It's interesting that when we ask people about caregivers or healthcare people who have given them hope, often the things that they say are the little things that made a huge, huge difference. And these are sometimes things that wouldn't be thought of as being a person's job, but also just the smallest of gestures. This last week, I was in a hospital visiting someone, and we needed Q-tips to put Vaseline on her lips. And we asked for Q-tips, and they said at the station, well, here's one, but we don't have very many here at all. So I had thought, well, I'll bring Q-tips tomorrow. By tomorrow, I had forgotten to bring Q-tips. And I just said it out loud, oh no, I forgot Q-tips. And someone passing by heard, came into the room, and she said, oh, I'll just get them from the desk. And we said, well, that's good, but there might not be any there. She said, well, just give me a minute then, and off she went, and she came back. She said, sorry it was so long, I just went to the next unit and got Q-tips. And that's such a silly little thing, but if I had to think of the most rewarding experience I had in hospital last week, it was really that. Some of the very simplest things, and this in patient research is recorded over and over again.
That gives me hope, actually, to think that what you've spoken about so far is that, the need to connect with people and to listen and to be, to change our perspective on what we think the patient needs or the client needs, to listen more to what it is that they're telling us. I think that's quite helpful. Can you talk about what is the smallest thing that I could do to increase a person's hope?
Well, that depends on what it is that threatens that person's hope. And people they can tell you, actually, if you ask, as I always do in counseling, because I work at a Center for Hope Studies, I always ask, when you think of how things are now, what is the thing that most threatens your hope? They'll tell you all kinds of things, and the thing that most threatens their hope is not always what we think it might be. Recently, a man told me that the thing that was most threatening his hope is that he was never going to be able to have a conversation on the street anymore without somebody asking him, how are you now? How's it going now? What was threatening his hope was the loss of happy, joyful, ordinary conversations with people and having every conversation be about illness. Other people will say, well, what threatens my hope is that my family might not get here in time or that I might not see them again. The things that threaten people's hope really vary from person to person, and they're not always what we would think they would be. So one of the ways to know what would be the smallest thing that I could do to increase anyone's hope would be to find out what is the thing that is threatening their hope right now. What is it that makes them not hopeful? I can remember being at someone's house near the time of a funeral, and I said, well, what can I do? And she said, the thing that you could do would be to look after my Aunt Pat, because Aunt Pat drives me crazy, and I'm at the bursting point. If you can do something about Aunt Pat, I think I can get through the rest of it. And doing something about Aunt Pat was really a very simple thing. It was just getting Aunt Pat to come on an errand, come to the drugstore and help me pick out things that we need to get. And then now, come to the grocery store. And, this was a very small thing to do, but it's not what I would have thought of.
Right. I don't have any more questions for you, but there was a question that was sent in on our registration form. I think you might have already answered it. The question was how to address refusal of palliative status. The person clinging to the hope of cure, wondering how to manage that.
Well, because I don't work directly in a hospital setting, I don't have a good sense of the real physical things that might be involved in making a changeover from active treatment status to palliative status. When we watch things from the outside, they look pretty simple, and we provide care for people. We try to relieve their pain. We provide other kinds of medications for them that we might provide whether they had palliative status or whether they had active treatment status. We talk about providing the best care possible. The difference between palliative status and active treatment status, of course, is that we've stopped looking for a cure or a treatment. However, this doesn't say that at the very last moment some treatment wouldn't come along that would be relevant. So I think we can move towards palliative status without saying, now we're going to give up all treatment. Now we're going to give up all hope. We can talk in terms of, we're going to move to this kind of care now because that seems the most relevant. It seems to be the thing that we need the most right now, is to take care of the pain. We don't have to talk in such an upfront way that it seems like there's just this one choice, palliative or not palliative. We can talk in terms of the best possible care. And if people still want to seek information about treatment, they're following a hope, and it's a hope that they have. And whatever we can do to respect that without having to do things that we don't believe in, whatever we can do to show respect for that, is really showing respect for the person.
Jennifer, we're ready for questions from the audience.
Hi, I was wondering, with my readings on hope, I was wondering what your beliefs are. Do you believe that there is such a thing as hopelessness, or do you believe that hope is innate and sometimes people just have to redefine their hope?
I do believe that there is such a thing as hopelessness. I don't necessarily believe it's a permanent condition, but certainly there are times when people cannot see hope, just as in when people are depressed. Good things may be happening to them, but they may not be able to see those good things because of their depression. So, hopelessness can exist. In fact, we did a random survey of 1,203 Albertans, a telephone survey about hope and health, and fully 25% of those people reported that they had experienced hopelessness at some time during the last 2 weeks. So I think it would be disrespectful to say to those 25%, oh, it wasn't really hopelessness, it was something else. They felt it as hopelessness and were willing to report it. So yeah, I think we'd be remiss if we said there isn't such a thing as hopelessness. The question is, how can we accept hopelessness and still be hopeful ourselves? One way that I can do that is I can think, perhaps this isn't permanent. Perhaps that person hasn't seen all the options. Perhaps it is impossible for that person to see hope now, but it would be possible for them to see it later.
When you were mentioning about, to find out what threatens hope in a particular patient, and you used the example of a man who felt he was never going to have a conversation on the street that wouldn't be about illness again. Once you find out what threatens hope in a particular patient, how do you deal with that?
Well, this is your opportunity to show how creative you might be. The person that I was talking about in this particular instance is the same person whose information I read a little earlier in this session. We had a long talk about what he could do to facilitate having conversations in the future, the kind that he wanted. Now, he, it turns out, was not powerless at all. He was the editor of a newspaper, and he said, but I can't always be writing about my illness in the newspaper. However, we had a chat about, well, what was he able to do and how often would he be able to do it? And so one thing he wrote was, cancer patients still like to talk about hockey pools, golf, music, and politics. It's talking over and over about treatment and prognosis that some of us find hard. So when you see me on the street, just say hi and start talking about something. So, that came out of, I didn't suggest that he write a column. We were thinking through alternatives that he has of speaking to other people. So it is really about connectedness and figuring out not what can I do to solve this problem, but how can we talk about it so that there will be more options. What ways might there be of making one small difference? Something that I could do to help think it through, to make it happen. There's no substitute for really listening to people and trying to think things through yourself. There can be never any magic formula that could take the place of a good, honest conversation with people and a willingness to hear what they have to say and to try to think that through with them rather than for them.
Hi, Wendy. I was wondering if you might comment on your own experience and maybe the literature too about sort of an innate sense of hopefulness and optimism.
Well, there's a lot of controversy, about whether any kind of personality factors, the degree to which they are inborn and the degree to which they are environmental. And hope is right up there with other positive psychology traits as personality factors. So I don't think there is the final diagnosis, as it were, about to what degree these things are innate. Certainly, though, it would appear that some people are more, by nature, are more optimistic than other people. And certainly Rick Snyder, who has done a great deal of work in the area of measurement of hope, he has tried to develop two scales, the trait hope scale, which would talk about hope as a trait, a personality trait, something quite stable, and then the state hope scale, which would measure how hopeful am I today, for example, about this particular thing. When we think of hope in terms of being a trait, then we have to accept that some people will find it easier to be hopeful than others. But we don't have to accept at all that we can't make a difference for all people. And the literature would seem to indicate that, say, your normal level of hopefulness was between 7 and 10, that some days, on really bad days, you might feel like you were down at 7. And we might be able to do certain things, to have certain conversations that would move you up to an 8. If my normal level of hope was down between 1 and 3, it's highly unlikely that the same intervention would bring me up to 8. But it might bring me from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. So we have to think that when we're doing interventions that might enhance hope or that might shrink hopelessness, that we're making a difference somewhere within a kind of normal range that any given person might have. Is that helpful?
It would be saying sort of that it's necessary maybe to separate the state of hopefulness from the trait of hopefulness?
Well, the state of hopefulness is very fluctuating for any of us depending on what's happening. And the trait of hopefulness is maybe more stable. So if we think about it that way, we see that we don't change the trait that much, but even still, we might fluctuate quite a bit in a range that is kind of natural for us. So there are people who tend to see the world in quite an optimistic manner no matter what is happening. Some days they might lose sight of that, but they might easily regain that. Other people who are more pessimistic by nature, they will see the world normally in quite a pessimistic way, but it doesn't mean that they can't be influenced in the other direction, just as when we go shopping, some of us might be more apt to choose red than blue, but we'll still buy a blue thing, and some of us might be apt to choose more blue than red, but we'll still buy a red thing if someone points it out to us.
Wendy, I was wondering if you could recommend any resources for our lending library, either which is used mostly for hospice volunteers and other professionals, but as well to give to patients or clients themselves on hope.
The book by Jevney and Miller called Finding Hope, Ways to See Hope in a Brighter Light. It's a very simple book of pictures and essays that people find to be extremely accessible. And anybody can pick up that book and start a conversation about hope from one page or another. They don't have to read it from start to finish. It's not really a how-to book, but it is a book with ways of thinking about hope. There's another book that's called It All Begins with Hope, and it also is by Ronna Jevney. It's a book of stories from the perspective of cancer patients, caregivers, and healthcare providers. It's very specific to the experience of hope and cancer, but it does address many issues that are relevant in palliative care. It's also quite an accessible book as well. It's not a how-to book about hope. It's a book with stories embedded about it.
I'd like to thank Wendy for joining us today and helping us to understand issues related to hope at the end of life.
This has been a Pallium Project Professional Development Podcast. For more information on the Pallium Project, including written transcripts of this session, please visit www.pallium.ca. Pallium.